The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Karoline Leavitt stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Dressed in a professional navy blue suit, she carried herself with quiet confidence. But it wasn't her poised demeanor or the stack of legal documents in her hand that caught everyone's attention. It was the small silver cross hanging from her neck. Judge Harrison, an older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for strict courtroom decorum, peered down at her from the bench. His expression hardened the moment he noticed the religious symbol resting against her blouse. He cleared his throat, silencing the courtroom. "You there," he said, his voice firm. "Approach the bench." A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, sensing tension in the air. Karoline calmly stepped forward, her face unreadable. "State your name for the record," the judge instructed. "Karoline Leavitt, Your Honor," she replied evenly. The judge studied her for a moment, then leaned forward. "Miss Leavitt, are you aware that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom?" His tone was sharp, laced with impatience. Karoline didn't flinch. "Your Honor, I'm here in a professional capacity. My attire meets the standard requirements for this courtroom." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "That necklace," he said, gesturing to the cross. "It's inappropriate. You're attempting to make a statement, and I won't allow it. Remove it or face consequences." A hushed whisper spread through the courtroom. Some attorneys exchanged skeptical looks. Others avoided eye contact with the judge, wary of his well-known intolerance for anything that challenged his authority. Karoline, however, remained composed. She clasped her hands together, tilting her head slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this cross is a personal item. It does not disrupt proceedings, nor does it interfere with my ability to practice law." The judge's expression darkened. "It's a distraction. I run a secular court. If I allow one person to wear religious symbols, where does it end?" Karoline met his gaze without hesitation. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe there's legal precedent that protects my right to wear this." The judge let out a short, dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Precedent? You think you can lecture me on courtroom rules?" He leaned back in his chair. "Enough! I'm not here to debate this with you. If you won't comply, then I have no choice but to impose a fine for disregarding my instructions." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Even the stenographer paused slightly before resuming her typing. Karoline remained still, her expression giving nothing away. She neither protested nor showed signs of distress. Instead, she simply nodded. "Understood, Your Honor," she said calmly. The judge seemed satisfied with her submission. "Good. Let this be a lesson." But before he could finish, Karoline took a step forward. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to make a legal argument before this court." The courtroom fell silent. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. "A legal argument?" he repeated, his tone dripping with condescension. "Very well, Miss Leavitt, but I warn you, if you waste this court's time, you will regret it." Karoline didn't waver. She straightened her shoulders and took a slow, measured breath. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "I believe you'll find that the law is very clear on this matter." The room bristled with anticipation. All eyes were on her. The judge, still convinced of his authority, leaned back in his chair, waiting to see how this young woman would attempt to challenge him. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Karoline Leavitt wasn't just another lawyer. She was about to dismantle everything he thought he knew about the law. The courtroom remained tense, every eye fixed on Karoline as she stood her ground before Judge Harrison. The judge's fingers drummed against the wooden bench, his patience thinning by the second. He had seen plenty of young attorneys try to challenge him before, but none had ever succeeded. In his mind, Karoline was no different, just another overconfident lawyer who thought she knew better than the court. "Miss Leavitt," the judge said sharply, "you've already been fined. I suggest you pay it and move on before you make this worse for yourself." Karoline didn't even blink. Her hands remained steady on the table before her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm yet respectful, "with all due respect, I am requesting the opportunity to present a legal argument regarding the fine you have imposed on me." The judge let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. "And what exactly do you think you can argue here, Miss Leavitt?" "You violated courtroom decorum, and I exercise my authority to enforce order. There is no debate to be had. A few people in the gallery exchanged knowing glances. Some of them had gone up against Judge Harrison before and knew how relentless he could be. But there was something about Karoline, her composure, her unwavering confidence, that made them hesitate before writing her off. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I respectfully disagree. This is not a simple matter of decorum. The fine imposed upon me is not only excessive, but it also raises serious constitutional concerns. As an officer of the court, I have a duty to uphold the law just as you do." Judge Harrison's lips curled into a smirk, the arrogance in his expression unmistakable. "You have a duty to follow the rules of this courtroom, Miss Leavitt. That crosses a violation of my standards, and that is the only matter at hand." Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Your Honor, are you stating, for the record, that my religious expression is grounds for financial penalty in this courtroom?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. Even the court clerk glanced up from her papers, sensing the weight of Karoline's words. The judge, however, was not impressed. "I am stating that you chose to defy my authority, and now you're facing the consequences. That is all," he said dismissively. Karoline inhaled slowly, then exhaled, keeping her emotions in check. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to clarify something. Is my attire otherwise appropriate for this courtroom?" Judge Harrison narrowed his eyes. "Yes, your attire is fine," he admitted begrudgingly. "And my behavior?" she pressed. "Have I been disrespectful or disruptive in any way?" The judge's fingers tapped impatiently on the bench. "Not yet," he muttered. "Then, Your Honor, if my conduct is professional and my attire meets courtroom standards, I must ask, on what legal basis am I being fined?" The courtroom fell silent. The judge's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he recovered. "I have the authority to enforce decorum in my courtroom, Miss Leavitt. That is the basis." Karoline nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "Of course, Your Honor, and as a presiding judge, you do have discretion in maintaining order. However," she paused, letting the moment stretch just long enough, "that discretion is not absolute. It must be exercised within the boundaries of the law, and in this case, your decision directly contradicts well-established legal precedent." A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. A few attorneys in the audience leaned forward, suddenly more interested in where this was going. The judge, on the other hand, let out a short, condescending laugh. "Legal precedent?" he repeated. "You truly believe that wearing a religious symbol in my courtroom is protected under the law?" Karoline didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor, and I can prove it." Judge Harrison shook his head. "This is absurd. If you wish to argue this, you'll do so formally. But in the meantime, you will pay the fine, or I will hold you in contempt." For the first time, a flicker of something sharp entered Karoline's expression. Not anger, not defiance, just pure, unshakable certainty. "Then, Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I formally challenge the fine on constitutional grounds. If you insist on enforcing it, I will file an immediate appeal." The judge's jaw tightened. "You would really escalate this over a simple fine?" Karoline met his gaze without hesitation. "Your Honor, this is not about a simple fine. This is about constitutional rights. If necessary, I will take this as far as it needs to go." For the first time since the exchange began, the judge hesitated. He hadn't expected her to push back this hard. He had thought she would pay the fine, maybe grumble about it afterward. Karoline stood tall, her hands resting lightly on the table before her. The weight of the room's attention pressed in from all sides, but she remained unshaken. Judge Harrison sat back, arms crossed, his expression a mix of amusement and irritation. He had given her a chance to argue, but he clearly expected her to fail. "The First Amendment of the United States Constitution," Karoline began, her voice steady, "explicitly protects the freedom of religion and expression. This protection extends to individuals in public spaces, including courtrooms, provided their conduct does not disrupt proceedings." The judge let out a dry chuckle. "Miss Leavitt, are you seriously suggesting that a courtroom should allow any and all personal expressions, regardless of decorum?" Karoline didn't flinch. "Not at all, Your Honor. What I am saying is that courts have consistently upheld the right of individuals to wear religious symbols, as long as they do not interfere with judicial proceedings. There is no disruption here. There is no violation of courtroom procedure. The fine imposed on me is therefore unlawful. The gallery murmured. A few attorneys in the audience exchanged glances, recognizing the boldness of her argument. The judge, however, was not impressed. "I have the authority to maintain order in my courtroom," he countered. "That includes regulating attire to ensure neutrality and respect." Karoline inclined her head slightly. "Your Honor, I am well aware of the court's authority over decorum, but with all due respect, neutrality does not mean the forced absence of religious expression. In Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, the Supreme Court ruled that personal expression is protected as long as it does not disrupt or interfere with proceedings. Furthermore, in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the court reaffirmed that no government authority can compel or suppress individual expression without compelling justification. The judge's jaw tightened. He had not expected her to be this well prepared. He straightened, glancing toward the court reporter, as if ensuring her words were properly documented. "This is a courtroom, not a school, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Your citation is irrelevant." Karoline smiled slightly. "With respect, Your Honor, the principle is the same. Whether in a school, a public square, or a courtroom, individuals do not forfeit their First Amendment rights upon entering government buildings. The burden is on the state, in this case the court, to justify any restriction on personal expression. You must provide a compelling legal reason for restricting my right to wear this cross. So far, no such justification has been given." The room fell silent. Even those who had initially dismissed her were now listening intently. The judge, however, was determined not to lose control of the exchange. "This is not about religion, Miss Leavitt," he said sharply. "This is about maintaining an environment where the focus is on the law, not personal beliefs." Karoline's expression remained impassive. "Then, Your Honor, may I ask, have any attorneys in this courtroom ever been fined for wearing symbols of their affiliations? A flag pin? A fraternity ring? A cultural emblem?" The judge's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Karoline let the silence linger before continuing. "Because if those items have never been questioned, then my cross is not the issue. The issue is selective enforcement." A low murmur spread through the room. The realization was setting in. The judge had made an arbitrary decision, and Karoline had just exposed it. "You're walking a dangerous line, Miss Leavitt," Judge Harrison warned. "I suggest you choose your words carefully." Karoline's posture remained perfectly composed. "Your Honor, my words are careful, and so is my argument. Lamb's Chapel versus Center Mauritius Union. Free School District reaffirmed that religious expression cannot be treated differently than secular expression in public institutions. By singling me out for wearing a religious symbol, this court has done exactly that." The tension in the room thickened. Even the attorneys who had initially dismissed her were now considering her argument. The judge's irritation deepened. "You are making this far more complicated than it needs to be," he said through gritted teeth. Karoline remained unfazed. "Your Honor, the law is clear. This fine is unconstitutional. It must be revoked." The judge's fingers curled around his gavel. He had underestimated her, badly, and now he was cornered. The air in the courtroom had shifted. What had begun as a simple disciplinary action had now unraveled into a full-fledged constitutional debate. One Judge Harrison had not anticipated. The weight of Karoline's words hung in the silence, her argument laid out with precision, backed by legal precedent. The judge's fingers tensed around the gavel, his jaw set, but for the first time, there was hesitation in his expression. Karoline stood unwavering, her presence unshaken by the judge's looming authority. She knew that in his mind, he was still holding on to the belief that he controlled this courtroom. But she also knew something else, something that the judge had not yet fully grasped. He was no longer in control of this moment. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Miss Leavitt, let me be perfectly clear. This is my courtroom, my rules, my authority. If I say something is disruptive, then it is disruptive. That is the end of it." Karoline met his gaze without flinching. Your Honor, the authority of the court is not above the Constitution. Cohen versus California established that government institutions cannot arbitrarily define disruption to suppress lawful expression. If there was an actual disruption in this courtroom, if my cross had caused chaos, impeded proceedings, or influenced the case at hand, then perhaps there would be a conversation to be had. But none of that has happened. A few people in the gallery nodded subtly, recognizing the truth in her words. The judge, however, wasn't ready to concede. He straightened, tapping his gavel once, a sharp sound echoing through the room. Enough of this. I am not interested in a lecture on constitutional law from a junior attorney. Karoline's lips pressed together for a brief moment, but not in defeat, rather in careful consideration of her next words. Then perhaps, Your Honor, you'd be more interested in hearing from the federal courts on this matter. The judge's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? She stepped forward slightly, her tone unwavering. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in Knight, state of Alabama, that government officials, including judges, cannot impose dress codes in a way that discriminates based on religious expression. Furthermore, in Chandler versus Siegelman, the court reaffirmed that any restriction placed on religious expression in a public setting must serve a compelling governmental interest. Your Honor, I respectfully ask, what compelling governmental interest is being served by fining me for wearing a small silver cross? A hush fell over the room. The attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances. The court stenographer barely looked away from her machine, typing every word, but even she seemed to be listening more intently. Judge Harrison shifted in his seat. He was accustomed to commanding absolute authority, to lawyers scrambling to comply with his rulings. What he had not prepared for was someone challenging him with airtight legal precedent. He exhaled slowly. Miss Leavitt, you are turning this into a spectacle. This is not about your religious beliefs. It's about decorum and respect for this institution. Karoline's expression didn't change. Respect for the law is what brought me here today, Your Honor. Respect for the Constitution, which protects the rights of every citizen, even inside this courtroom. You have ruled against my cross, but you have not ruled against similar symbols worn by others. That is selective enforcement. That is unconstitutional. The judge's grip on his gavel tightened. He could feel control slipping through his fingers, and he despised it. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not so publicly. But Karoline wasn't just questioning him, she was cornering him, legally and logically. He glanced toward the prosecution table, where a seasoned attorney in a dark gray suit was watching the exchange with quiet amusement. The prosecutor, a man who had argued before this very judge countless times, offered a slight shrug as if to say, "She's got a point, and you know it." Judge Harrison let out a slow, measured breath. You are aware that by challenging this ruling, you are risking contempt of court, correct? Karoline nodded without hesitation. I am aware, Your Honor, and I am prepared to take that risk, because this is not just about me. This is about the law. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the judge's face. He was trapped. If he doubled down, he would be knowingly enforcing a ruling that could easily be overturned on appeal. If he backed down, he would have to concede that he had overstepped his authority. The entire courtroom held its breath. The next words out of Judge Harrison's mouth would determine everything. The room was suffocatingly silent, the weight of Karoline's argument pressing down like a slow-moving storm. Judge Harrison's fingers curled around the armrests of his chair, his expression carefully measured, but she could see it, the hesitation in his eyes, the slight furrow in his brow. He was a man used to absolute control, and she had shaken that foundation. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly. Miss Leavitt, I am warning you one last time. This is a court of law, not a political debate. Your insistence on challenging my authority is bordering on defiance. Karoline remained steady. Your Honor, defiance is disregarding the law. I am upholding it. She let her words settle before continuing, her voice firm but even. If this fine stands, it sets a dangerous precedent. It means that any judge in any courtroom can arbitrarily decide which expressions are acceptable and which are not, regardless of constitutional protections. That is not law, Your Honor. That is personal preference masquerading as authority. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Some were attorneys who had practiced in this very courtroom for years, accustomed to Judge Harrison's strict and sometimes unpredictable rulings. Others were civilians, watching as Karoline dismantled a case that should have been simple, watching as she exposed the cracks in the system. The judge's lips pressed together in a thin line. He wasn't used to being challenged so openly, and certainly not by a young attorney still early in her career. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Are you suggesting that I am biased, Miss Leavitt?" Karoline met his gaze without hesitation. "I am suggesting, Your Honor, that the law should be applied consistently. If this courtroom allows secular symbols, then it must allow religious ones. Anything else is selective enforcement, and selective enforcement is unconstitutional." The tension in the room thickened. Judge Harrison glanced toward the prosecution table, where the state's attorney sat watching with quiet interest. The prosecutor, a seasoned professional with a reputation for choosing his battles wisely, didn't seem inclined to intervene. In fact, there was the faintest ghost of a smirk on his lips, as though he was enjoying watching the judge navigate this unexpected storm. Judge Harrison exhaled sharply. "Miss Leavitt, your citations are impressive, but you are missing the point. This is not about singling you out. This is about maintaining order and professionalism in this courtroom." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Then let me ask you this, Your Honor. Would a defendant appearing before you wearing a hijab be fined? What about a yarmulke, a Sikh turban?" The question hung in the air like a sharp blade. The judge hesitated. Too long. The silence was an answer in itself. Karoline pressed on, her voice unwavering. "If the answer is no, then my cross is no different. It does not disrupt. It does not disrespect the court, and it does not interfere with the law. It is a personal expression of faith, and the Constitution does not allow the government to pick and choose which religious symbols are acceptable and which are not." A heavy pause. Then from the back of the room, a quiet voice. "She's right." Heads turned as an older attorney, a man with graying hair and years of experience etched into his face, spoke up. He wasn't addressing Karoline. He was addressing the judge. "She's citing precedent correctly. If this fine is enforced, she has more than enough grounds to appeal, and she'll win." More murmurs, some in agreement, others simply processing what had just been said. Judge Harrison's expression darkened. His authority had never been so openly questioned, so publicly scrutinized. He tapped his gavel twice. "Order!" The room quieted, but the shift had already happened. The judge knew it. Karoline knew it. Everyone knew it. Judge Harrison inhaled deeply. "Miss Leavitt, I will consider your argument carefully." Karoline nodded, her expression composed. "Thank you, Your Honor." But she knew. She had already won. The courtroom remained still, the tension lingering in the air like an unspoken verdict. Judge Harrison had said the words, "This court will take the matter under advisement," but everyone in the room knew what they really meant. Karoline had cornered him with the law, leaving him no option but to quietly withdraw. Yet the judge refused to openly concede. He straightened in his chair, his expression unreadable, as if he could somehow regain the authority he had lost in the last 20 minutes. The sound of papers shuffling echoed in the quiet room as he glanced down, pretending to review notes, but Karoline knew better. There was nothing to review. He was stalling. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss Leavitt, while your argument is compelling, let me remind you that courtroom decorum is not a matter of debate." Karoline held her ground. "And I agree, Your Honor, but the enforcement of that decorum must be fair, consistent, and constitutional." Judge Harrison exhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. He hated this, hated losing, hated the eyes on him, knowing that if he pushed further, he would walk directly into a losing battle. The gallery was dead silent, waiting. The prosecution table remained still. Even the stenographer, despite her robotic movements, seemed to be absorbing every second of this moment. Then it happened. The smallest thing. A smirk. It was the prosecutor, sitting in his chair, arms crossed, watching the judge with quiet amusement. It was barely there, a slight curve of his lips, a knowing glance. But it was enough. Judge Harrison saw it, and he knew. Pushing further would mean risking an appeal, risking his reputation, and worse, risking becoming a cautionary tale in every constitutional law class across the country. Slowly, his fingers released the edge of the bench. His expression hardened, but his voice was measured when he finally spoke. "The fine is rescinded." A murmur swept through the gallery, quickly silenced by the sharp rap of the gavel. Karoline didn't move, didn't let the satisfaction show on her face. But inside she felt it, victory. Not just for herself, but for every person who would ever walk into a courtroom wearing their faith on their sleeve or around their neck. Judge Harrison's eyes met hers one last time, and for a fleeting second, she saw something unexpected. Respect. Resentful, begrudging respect, but respect nonetheless. "This court is adjourned." The gavel fell. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Karoline gathered her notes, sliding them into her bag with steady hands. Around her, the gallery was still buzzing, hushed conversations whispering through the air. She could feel eyes on her, some filled with admiration, others with curiosity. As she turned to leave, a voice stopped her. "Miss Leavitt." She turned. Attorney Evelyn Carter was standing now, her expression unreadable. "That was impressive." Karoline offered a small professional nod. "Just doing what's right." Karoline took a slow breath before stepping toward the exit. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, she realized something. This wasn't just about a fine. It never had been. This was about proving that no one, not even a judge, was above the Constitution. And today she had done just that.